Good morning to you all. My name is Lucy Stone, and I've been invited to tell you about myself this morning. I am a suffragist. I believe in votes for women, and an abolitionist. I stand against slavery. I'm surprised that at my age you want to hear my story, but I'm a Unitarian like you, and so my life is a piece of your history. I was born on a summer day like this one in 1818 on a farm at Coy's Hill in West Brookfield, Massachusetts, east of Boston. I was raised in the Orthodox Congregational Church there. My family included my parents, three brothers and three sisters, and Aunt Sally, my father's sister, who had been abandoned by her husband. Stone ancestors arrived in Massachusetts in 1635, pursuing religious freedom, and my grandfather was a captain in the American Revolution. There was only one will in my family, and that was my father's, Francis Stone. Hannah, my mother, sold eggs and cheese, but my father had control over the proceeds. Since she felt she had a right to her earnings, Hannah sometimes stole coins from my father's purse or secretly sold a cheese. Indeed, my father denied my mother many things she wanted if he considered them trivial. It was clear to me that women were at the mercy of their husband's goodwill. I resented the divine sanction of women's subjugation found in the Bible verse, "And thy desire shall be thy husband, and he shall rule over thee." I resolved to call no man my master, to never marry, to obtain the highest education I could, and to earn my own livelihood. My mother believed strongly in education, and so I attended primary school regularly. I wanted to go to college like my brothers, but my father refused to pay for my education. And so at 16, I went to work as a school teacher in a district school. In fact, one winter, I substituted in the classroom where my brother Bowman taught. But of course, I was paid far less than he had received. I protested to the school committee. They replied that they could only give me a woman's pay. In fact, lower pay for women was one of the arguments cited by those promoting the hiring of women teachers. The men said, to make education universal, it must be at a moderate expense, and women can afford to teach for one half or even less the salary which men would ask. I spent a semester at Mount Holyoke College, but I had to return home when my sister fell ill. Later, I learned that Oberlin was the only college in the United States open to women and African Americans at that time. And so I taught and saved for nearly 10 years before entering Oberlin in 1843 when I was 25. At Oberlin, I studied classics, philosophy, language, and mathematics. When I learned that women were not allowed to enroll in public speaking classes, I formed a women's rhetoric and debating club. I declined to write a commencement speech that would have been read in public by a man. I was the first Massachusetts woman to earn a college degree in 1847. I earned money teaching a class of fugitive slaves, and through my students, I became committed to the abolitionist movement. While at Oberlin, I was required to attend religious services led by Charles Finney, a hellfire and brimstone preacher. This made me disillusioned with the congregational church of my upbringing, especially after discovering that my church would not allow me to vote in its proceedings. There was a meeting to decide if the chapel should expel one of its members for anti-slavery activities. I raised my hand to vote in objection, but I was told my vote would not count since I am a woman. This led to my decision to declare myself Unitarian, and this is my religious identity to this day, although I am now over 70. I gave my first public speech entitled "The Province of Woman" in 1847 in Gardner, Massachusetts, in the Congregational Church where my brother was minister. And this began my public lecturing career. I felt called to labor for the elevation of my sex. William Lloyd Garrison, you might know that name, hired me to write and deliver abolitionist speeches for the American Anti-Slavery Society. I became quite famous as a public speaker. I traveled the country by train, stagecoach, and horse-drawn carriage, speaking for women's rights and the abolition of slavery. I addressed every state legislature, and I signed the call for the first National Women's Rights Convention in Worcester in 1850. During this time, I met and worked with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Lucretia Mott. In 1855, when I was 37, I married Henry Blackwell. Henry is the brother of Elizabeth Blackwell, a classmate of mine at Oberlin, and the first woman physician in the United States. At first, I told Henry I did not want to surrender control of my life, as was required legally of a married woman. But Henry convinced me that we could create an equal partnership and could together accomplish more than either of us could alone. He and I drew up a marriage protest, which expressed our outrage about women's lack of legal or property rights in marriage and omitted the word obey from the wedding ceremony. News of our protest was sent to the local newspaper and then spread across the country. We were married by Thomas Wentworth Higginson, a Unitarian minister. I refused to be supported by my husband and insisted on paying half of our mutual expenses. I kept my own name when I married Henry, since I believe a wife should no more take her husband's name than he should take hers. My name is my identity. It must not be lost. In the years after my marriage, other women who decided to keep their own names were referred to as Lucy Stoners. I continued my activism for 2 years after marrying Henry, but after the birth of our daughter Alice, I did less traveling. In 1858, I reminded Americans of the no taxation without representation principle. My refusal to pay property taxes was punished by the impoundment and sale of our family's household goods. I was involved in planning the National Women's Rights Convention, and Henry and I founded the weekly newspaper, The Woman's Journal, to support and publicize policies and activities of the American Women's Suffrage Association. Later, our daughter Alice edited that journal. My life has placed me in a position to measure my beliefs, my opinions, and my desires against those of family members, my church, and my society. As a woman, I was advised to concede my ideas to those around me, but I have chosen another path. I found my identity not in following established custom, but in trying to make the world a better place. I stand for the right of woman to the control of her own person as a moral, intelligent, and accountable being. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Olympia Brown. I want to express my gratitude to my friend Lucy Stone for encouraging me to speak to you today. Public speaking was not always easy for me. One of my challenges was to overcome a high, thin voice, often ridiculed by my fellow seminarians. I attended the D.O. Lewis School of Speech in Boston, where I learned a series of exercises to build up my lung capacity. I did these exercises throughout my life and became a powerful public speaker. My neighbors often heard me reciting my sermons to the flowers in my garden. I was born in 1835 in Prairie Ronde Township, Michigan, the oldest of 4 children. My parents were farmers in what was then considered frontier land. My parents regarded religion and education for both boys and girls as very important. They were Universalists, and my mother in particular was strongly influenced by the teachings of Hosea Ballou. Encouraged by my parents to pursue an education, my sister and I enrolled at Mount Holyoke Female Seminary in 1854. Unfortunately, the repressive atmosphere, with its emphasis on unquestioned obedience, and the intolerant religious orthodoxy that prevailed at the time, were totally unsuited to us. In 1856, I enrolled at the newly founded Antioch College, a coeducational institution. While there, I arranged for Antoinette Brown Blackwell, a congregational minister, to come and preach. It was the first time I had heard a woman preach, and the sense of victory lifted me up. I was determined to become a Universalist minister and had to convince St. Lawrence University's theological school to admit me, although it was not an option for women. Mr. Ebenezer Fisher, the president, replied that I would be admitted, but he did not think women were called to ministry. When I completed my course of study in 1863, I had to convince the male ministers of the St. Lawrence Universalist Association to vote to ordain me so I could be called to parish ministry. The positive reception I received when I preached at local churches swayed the opinions of many of the ministers in my favor, and I was ordained. Mr. Fisher himself had so far overcome his feelings that he took part in the ordination exercises. I became an ordained minister in the Universalist Church in 1864, the first woman in the United States to be ordained by an ecclesiastical body. My first pastorate was in Weymouth, Massachusetts. In 1867, with the blessing of my congregation, I spent months in Kansas speaking on behalf of women's suffrage, a cause I was passionate about. They assured me that speaking engagements, lodgings, a traveling companion, a conveyance, and a driver had all been arranged. When I arrived in Kansas, I found that I did have speaking engagements, 300 of them in 4 months, but no companion, no lodgings, no conveyance, and no driver. Fortunately, the people of Kansas were generous and helpful. They were large and receptive audiences, but in the end, the men of Kansas defeated proposed amendments to the state constitution that would have granted universal suffrage. I felt the defeat keenly. But Susan B. Anthony wrote me an uplifting letter. Never was defeat so glorious a victory. We shall win. The day breaks. 6 years later, I accepted a call to the Universalist Church in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Here I met John Willis, a publisher. We married in 1873, and like my friend Lucy Stone, and by mutual agreement with John, I kept my own name. We had 2 wonderful children, a son and daughter. I resigned my ministry for a time, but considering my calling and options, I offered my services as parish minister to the Universalist congregation in Racine, Wisconsin. The church was in unfortunate circumstances, in debt and adrift. I accepted the challenge and moved my family to Wisconsin in 1878. You may think it's strange that I could only find a field in rundown or comatose churches, but must remember that the pulpits of all the prosperous churches were already occupied by men and were looked forward to as the goal of all the young men coming into the ministry, with whom I, at first, the only woman preacher in the denomination, had to compete. All I could do was to take some place that had been abandoned by others and make something of it. And this I was only too glad to do. I worked to rejuvenate the church and establish it as a center of learning and culture and a forum for the discussion of social issues of the time, including women's suffrage. I invited Julia Ward Howe, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony to air their views from the pulpit. Under my ministry, women began to vote and hold offices in the church. After 9 years of ministry, I left a thriving congregation and moved on to a new challenge to become an activist for women's rights. For the next 32 years, I labored, spoke, and demonstrated on behalf of this cause. In 1884, I became president of the Wisconsin Women's Suffrage Association, a position I held until 1912. I sided with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the belief that suffrage would be best attained through a federal amendment to the Constitution rather than on a state-by-state referendum. After Susan died in 1906, I continued to work for this cause with Lucy Barnes and Alice Paul as part of a new organization, the Congressional Union, later known as the Women's Party. Some activists criticized me, saying that picketing and marching were improper, disgusting, and reprehensible. I said that women had been dignified and proper for over 60 years, and we still do not have the vote. It was a cold, rainy, windy day in March 1917 when we picketed the White House to make it known to President Wilson that we demanded a constitutional amendment for women's suffrage. I was 82 at the time. It was not until after the conclusion of World War I that President Wilson gave his support to women's suffrage, and Congress passed the 19th Amendment. On Election Day morning, November 2nd, 1920, I made my way to the polling station. It was 53 years since I had campaigned in Kansas. I was 85 years old and one of the first to vote. In a sermon in late 1920, I spoke at the Racine Church on the changes that had taken place since my resignation as minister. I said, the grandest thing has been the lifting up of the gates and the opening of the doors to the women of America, giving liberty to 27 million women, thus opening to them a new and larger life, and a higher ideal. I testify to the importance in my life of universalism, the faith in which we have lived, for which we have worked, and which has bound us together as a church. Dear friends, stand by this faith. There is nothing so important to you as to be loyal to this faith, which has placed before you the loftiest ideal, which has comforted you in sorrow, strengthened you for the noble duty, and made the world beautiful for you.